Thank you for joining us today. We're getting off to another great conference. Already had a couple good reports from the presentation that was earlier, my time during sleeping, but I've heard good feedback on already. This particular presentation, I'm going to focus on some of the critical elements in organization design. The more that I get into understanding some of the problems with organizational change, I see them as being coming from the design aspect, not so much the change methodology. And as we need to go to an environment of more routine adaptive changes, this then implies some changes also to the way we design and operate our organizations. I'm going to focus a little bit on the history to show you where design has come and where it's going. A little bit of time on the impact of technology. Technology has really driven changes dramatically over the years and even more so now. And then kind of conclude it with what we're talking about as next generation design, where the field of organization design is going. Going forward then, in many organizations, reorganization is now the new normal. And to a large extent, it's really an act of doing something. Things aren't working and their default is to reorganize and hopefully go ahead and address the problems that are occurring. But oftentimes they end up creating a new set of problems and they just end up going back and forth and shifting between different problems, so to speak, as they change their structure. In a recent survey, 70% of CEOs reported a reorganization in the previous 2 years. Further, majority actually expected another reorganization in the next 2 years. So they're seeing this as a regular activity, and this is a high-level CEO perspective that doesn't take into account all of the division and department reorganizations that are underway. Further, these organizations generally that are every 2 to 3 years, they take 18 months to complete. If you put that to some realization, then they're really spending anywhere from a half to 3/4 of their time doing some type of reorganization, only to find that it doesn't really work well and they need to go through that cycle again. This then creates a problem of really how effective are these? And when they talk about effectiveness, they've shown that fewer than a third actually delivered any material involvement and improvement. That's any. So 2/3 are actually a net zero, or some actually have destroyed value. And I've actually seen that in a couple cases. So the challenge then is reorganization is the new normal. Change is impacting design, but we're not really gaining any ground, so to speak. Put this in some perspective, though. Let's go back to the 1850s. This was an organization chart. It was a functional chart, and it was the first time one was created. And this was for the New York and Erie Railroad. It shows basically a traditional hub and spoke functional model. And as expected, this was pretty much a command and control. The organization at that time was seen as running a large machine, really similar to the large locomotives they were running at that time. But it was also basically expanding on the traditional span of control and other management practices. This also then laid the groundwork for Frederick Taylor in 1909 with his scientific management, where there was really a focus on work standardization and a human tool integration. This was a really mechanical look at organization and really dominated the thinking at that time and for many years after. Shifting, though, to 1951, there was actually a major change in the way that organization design was thought about, and that was a social technical systems approach. And this came out of Great Britain in the mines that they're having problems. This is the coal mines. They were introducing technology into the mines, and many of the engineers that were developing this technology had not actually even been in the mines. The technology was being placed in there, and the people that were in the mines were actually rather resistant, but it wasn't so much as a change resistance as the equipment wasn't really being designed for their needs, because the people designing them truly didn't know what happened underground. And in many situations, the equipment was not only improper and failed to function well, but is actually dangerous for the miners. So this was put into some study as to how can this be improved. And in doing that, there was actually probably one of the first situations of a positive deviance study. They found that some mines actually had incorporated the technology very well, while others did not do it at all and actually had reduced their productivity. So in the process of understanding what the differences were, they came up with a better theory then of how the people and technology can be integrated well within a work environment. This came up with then 4 different principles really of design. The first was the that how the people should interact with the machines. They should really complement and not be part of the machines itself. This was a rethinking then of the human aspect relative to the technology itself, and how better to integrate that and use the human capabilities to better utilize the technology itself. They also came up with a clear point of view that the problems are best addressed by those who are experiencing those problems. In this case, the problems were being experienced by the miners themselves at the coal face, while the problems were actually being addressed by the engineers who were rather clueless about actually what happened underground and were developing these great machines in their theoretical drafting rooms. They also evaluated how people actually worked together. This was a team process, and that the team was actually more important than the individual jobs and how the work was accomplished, particularly when you've got people working at different tasks underground, and those had to be sequenced. The machinery itself oftentimes would fight that proper sequencing, and they would run into bottlenecks. The fourth aspect was that the people were actually capable of self-management. Many of the mines that were successfully using the technology had actually developed their own self-management operations at the coal face, because so often the supervisors really weren't there at the coal face. They were further down the tunnels, because they were managing multiple work groups at the different work sites. So in this case, the people were actually able to do self-management very well if given the direction and the alignment between operations. Going forward then, the Socio-technical systems grew in its research, and by the 1970s, there was actually some global spread with some effort to, quote, restore dignity and meaning to workers. This sounds rather familiar even today, but that was a critical component of how to basically give more engagement in the workforce. Going forward then, the academic interest really developed some compelling evidence, but the limited adoption became rather evident in that even within the coal mines, where they showed how some mines were doing so well with the use of the technology, other mines actually refused to use that research and continued doing rather low productive work practices because of the traditional leadership. The leaders were afraid of giving up control in the traditional mindsets, and command and control still dominated, not only in some of the mines, but in really much of the world, such that the social technical systems capabilities were not fully employed because of the feeling of having to be in control and the fears that were associated with giving control up to self-managed work teams. When we shift into the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a dramatic shift to focus on work processes. This was the business reengineering, Lean, Six Sigma, total quality, all of those. These were actually rather quickly adopted because they actually provided managers a new pathway for control, such that they were able to focus on the work processes and gained more control, so it was easily integrated into their management practices. The people, in this sense, still serve the machine while controlling the variances. So this then brings up the question of where are we now? When we take a look at the organizations as to the time and the innovation, the management practices and leadership of organizations has increased, but if you read through many of the management books over the last 30, 40 years, there hasn't been that many great advances. At the same time, though, technology has rather dramatically increased, and even on the horizon are a series of other activities of artificial intelligence, the practice of platforms, cloud computing, intelligent robots, Internet of Things, blockchain, virtual reality. These are all things that are now starting to be integrated into the workforce, but we haven't really thought through of the gap then of how best to manage the organization with new evolving technology. This is kind of the challenge we're facing right now, which then lays out how do you really manage organizations with even more technology going forward at an increasing rate. On top of that, there's been an increase in manual labor, really giving away to a different type of workforce, a need to think, innovate, and apply the new technology. An example is that there's a TV show on now that talks about workers, the value that they bring in different types of jobs. This is a Mike Rowe continuation of his Dirty Jobs series. And there was one recently on a fishing ship. And everyone thinks about fishing ships. If you throw the net out, you haul it in, and you throw the fish in the hold, and you take it to shore to can or to freeze. This was not that way at all. This was literally a fishing vessel that was a factory on the sea, and a highly computerized factory, from the net operation through to how the fish were put in. They weren't put into a hold. They were put into a manufacturing plant right in the ship itself, so that the fish were headed, gutted, flash frozen, and with forklifts put into a hold, so that when that ship reached shore, it wasn't delivering fresh fish, it was delivering frozen fish. And there was computers from every aspect of the ship. The control room looked like a modern day NASA control room. The area underneath the ship that was all of the processing had technology everywhere. This show actually highlighted some of the people that worked there, and they were highly educated people. There were very few people on this ship that did not interact with technology in a traditional fishing way. This is the type of work that we're now facing. Also, the workforce expectations have changed, and that people want some meaning. They're identifying themselves traditionally in their job, and to the extent that that becomes part of their identity, they're looking for meaning. but they're also looking for the challenges and something that comes up frequently called fun. It's hard to say exactly what fun is because that's very personal. But again, it's how the work is seen as being motivational and not seen as a drudge. We're also facing a workforce that has digital natives, people that are entering the workforce that have grown up with computers. They're now moving into leadership positions, and they're bringing that expectation of computers as just being everywhere all the time. They're looking for then the autonomy. But again, when you look at the research, they're not looking at individual autonomy. They're looking at the team experiences and how the teams can operate autonomously from a command and control. So it's a different thinking of autonomy. Traditionally, we thought about this from an individual perspective. This workforce is looking at it from a team perspective. They also want personal development. They're not expecting to be in the same job forever. They're looking for how to develop into meaningful positions and how to express themselves while at the same time maintaining some work-life balance. This then goes into a number of situations that is actually similar to what the coal miners were facing in the early 50s. They want some self-direction. They want to be able to integrate with the technology, but they want to really relieve themselves of being under the command and control that is traditionally found in the workplace. The traditional response has been reorganize. This has been a series of episodic change initiatives, but they generally address the symptoms only because they reorganize within the assumptions that a traditional command and control structure brings. And even the command and control of a hierarchy oftentimes really gets into not only a dynamic shifting of structures, but incorporating a matrix within that either entirely or in part of the organization, because they're neither one really works. So they're trying to do a matrix to do a little bit of both. But again, the matrix is nothing more than two traditional approaches interfaced. So oftentimes organizations are shifting between two different types of hierarchical approaches or blending different types of hierarchies into one structure. There's also often no power involved or co-design in what the organization should look like. When we think about change, then we still think about it within the old unfreeze, change, and refreeze approach. But in reality, we don't really have something that's ever totally frozen, really dealing with slush all the time. It's partially frozen, partially melted, and it's always evolving. This then gives into a need for change that's viewed as routine, and a design for change. When we take a look for design for change, let's look back then into looking at the Socio-technical Systems Design, but look at it from the next generation. This is some research that has been published in the last couple of years in the Journal of Change Management, where we're now facing higher employee expectations, at the same time, a need for quicker change. The technology has been changing quicker than the management systems, so there's some catch-up that's needed. The machines, though, are developing some intelligence that not only are taking away from some of the need for manual labor, but they're also using some rule-based decisions to replace some of the low-level management decisions themselves. This places even more emphasis on how the knowledge work itself is changing. But we're also learning that technology alone is not the solution. As we go through COVID, we're having all types of global supply changes that are disrupted because we had built a very efficient supply chain, but it lacked agility to impact how to change itself when there's a disruption. And the discussion is rather growing as what the Great Resignation looks like. The level of worker engagement is extremely low and a great concern, because as people are facing jobs they don't like, are seeing new alternatives, are experiencing new ways of working, new mandates and controls in their lives, they're rethinking their life and what they want out of it. And this then lays the groundwork for how work not only is changing, but how workers are expecting that work environment to change. From this perspective, then, the classical social technical system design is actually evolving more into a post-industrial world. From this particular article in the Journal of Change Management, they had a number of predictions about how organizations were going to be changing into the future and the role of organization design to make those adaptive changes. First was that the technology is actually going to change what an organization is. And this is kind of an interesting point of view, because we think about organization as a collective group of people working together for a common purpose, but increasingly we're talking about an ecosystem, different partner organizations coming together for different project type of works. And the membership then is shifting as the projects evolve and new projects come into being. And where the work actually takes place is no longer limited to a single location. There's all types of geographical combinations coming into place. What we had talked about before was a boundaryless organization. And to some extent, that's becoming even more true in that there's a legal definition of an organization, but at the same time, there is the organizations that is defined by the work process itself and how all of those work relationships can span multiple legal entities. Okay. We're also starting to shift our thinking about what an organization's shape looks like and how you optimize. Traditionally, we thought about optimization within one entity, and the fight has been to do away with sub-optimization in the silos of an organization and get it back to a single optimization. But when you're dealing with multiple entities coming together, you're now faced not only with the challenge of how do you do a global optimization, but how do you then align optimization among multiple entities that may be working together for a relatively short period of time. And one recommendation is a dynamic negotiation process. Now, from this perspective, he says, oh, this sounds very difficult. How do you do that dynamic negotiation process with multiple entities coming together? Well, this is being done today by the Hire Group in China. They have over 4,000 micro enterprises operating as basically entrepreneurial organizations under the Hire umbrella. They actually have a contracting process that shares value across the relationships between the micro enterprises. But at the same time that they have that contract, it's also a dynamic negotiating process, because a potential change that will benefit the total organization oftentimes has a cost benefit imbalance across individual relationships, such that if one microenterprise takes on additional cost and the benefit will be realized elsewhere in the microenterprise connections, they can then dynamically renegotiate that connection and thereby share the benefit across multiple nodes of the network. So this joint optimization with the dynamic process is actually underway right now on a very large scale. We're also talking about the distributed decision-making that moves the power from the top of the organization to the peripheral, which gets back to solving the problems where the people are experiencing them. This then puts more focus on the need for alignment, how to communicate the direction, the expertise and the resources, the allocation of them such that they are where they benefit the organization best, but at the same time, take into account the impact that it might have over time as those resources and people's expertise are shifted. We're also talking then about the change and acceleration that comes just from the interconnectivity. One of the challenges of siloed organizations is that they slow down communication because of the communication up, across, down an organization. This is done away with when you increase connectivity within the organization, but at the same time, that also then can accelerate the change because those relationships, the communications are moving quicker. This then gets into a situation of how do you change quickly? And that is becoming more really important than even stable efficiency. In such times, the agility has better value than stable efficiency. Shifting then into the fifth of new ways of actually working together. This is really a restatement of some of the earlier, and that the emergent capabilities and the ability to put an organization together quickly and easily is a more deciding factor for increasing value than actually planning such structures that will have a short life before they need to be reorganized. There's also gaining importance in the supporting technology. Traditionally, we've thought about technology as the core value chain, but with collaboration, there's more focus, particularly with the pandemic that we've experienced, on the collaborative technology, how to communicate and connect people in ways that haven't been possible in the past. The technology also plays a part in discovery of information, in the ability to have a lot of information available creates a problem of how do you find what you need when you need it. Technology is starting to play a role increasingly there, such that technology then is not only limited to the value chain, but throughout all the supporting functions. There's also increased information flows. And this then goes back to what I just said, the need to filter that information and how to align the responses to growing information as it becomes available. There's then some needs for distributed leadership instead of the top down, a way of integrating teams and work units together. This gets then into how do you clarify decision rights and involve others in the decisions and their implementation when the traditional chain of command and authority and empowerment is not necessarily there. There's also then the direct communication for the coordination of parallel decision-making such that the decisions themselves that may create conflict are identified and a response is quickly enacted. The ninth prediction that these authors had then was a general shift of rethinking of being managed to a team self-management component. So these were then 9 predictions that the next generation Socio-technical Systems Design would be facing right now, so to speak. Looking at this from design elements standpoint, then certain things come into play. First off is obviously the purpose and its clarification, but closely associated with that is the sustainability of the organization, how value is created within that purpose clarification. Okay. But there's also another component that is equally important here of how it really interfaces in not only that organization, but within an ecosystem such that the purpose of that organization is then integrated with other organization's purposes, such that there's a common thread that they can basically pool their activities, such that you're not doing everything within just a single organization, but doing a dynamic ecosystem development. This then requires some thinking about cross-organization alignment. And this cross-organization is not only cross within the organization, but cross between organizations. And how do you allow self-organization to really emerge without being suppressed? Too often in our traditional organizations, with the emphasis on control, we suppress the need for change and the ability to self-organize. By removing those barriers, you then create additional opportunities. You also have then some key stakeholders that need to be brought into the design. Key then is the customer experience and the employee experience. These are all then closely tied together into the total design itself. But pulling it all together then is a guiding principles and behaviors that are needed. So often we think about the control of being a management function. In this case, there is some indirect control where the principles and behaviors then provide some internal tension and some guidelines for the decision making, such that you can have self-organization. So that control isn't necessarily eliminated, but it changes its form from a management down structure into a principle-driven and expectations limited type of an approach. Then there's also a performance and operations management. And this is kind of an interesting topic that Reg will be talking about tomorrow, and I'll be talking a little bit about on Thursday. In that, when you look at a performance and operations management system, it's oftentimes designed for control of an organization. And that when you go to an alternate structure, the need and the design itself of these measurement systems also evolve away from control into helping to communicate and align work processes. So that's a different way of thinking about performance measurement. When you pull all of this together, then what are the critical factors that must be identified and recognized when we design the organizations we now need? This is a more dynamic approach and is a next generation social technical integration. And there's a number of different key design factors. One is the designing for the purpose, alignment, and change. When we talk about the structure and the operational processes, a key component then is not the control, but purpose alignment and allowing routine adaptive change to meet that alignment need as the environment changes or new opportunities are created. There's also a need to serve the internal customers. Oftentimes we talk about an external customer interface and the need for that knowledge to communicate throughout the organization. But if you have a clear internal customer relationship, that external communication of customer needs isn't necessarily a separate communication process as much as is a ripple through the internal customer linkages. So it's a different way of thinking about how do you communicate what the end customers need, because that needs to be communicated through purpose alignment throughout the network of the value within the organization itself. We're also talking then about how do you distribute the decision-making to those that are directly impacted. And part of this gets into the entrepreneurial approach of the need to take risk, but to take the risk if the loss is affordable, such that you're able to keep moving within some ability to make decisions. You involve people as necessary to identify the loss, but if the worst case scenario is acceptable to the organization, then you move ahead and you don't wait for any further decision-making process. Because if it turns out to be wrong, you can identify that quickly and reverse course of action, or basically treat it as a learning experience and move on and learn from that and do better. Okay. A third component then is thinking about organizations more modular, in that you're not just moving boxes on the organization chart, you're rethinking about the linkages between parts of the organization and how they're built around the work, which is driven by purpose, not control. And then you deal with the shifting membership. This gets into some interesting aspects then on the organization itself and the loyalties to the organization, which requires some transparency as to the purpose, the alignment, and how people identify themselves within the organization. There's also then thinking about communication and connections and not only work process, but information flow of the shortest path connections. This is a social network analysis, but it needn't be a separate study as much as it is to identify what actually happens within an informal organization. So often we think about the formal organization that is in the organization chart, the formal linkages, but the informal organization is where people are making the connections to basically make things work because the formal connections are not working. This then is automatically setting up the shortest path connections by default because they're not existent in the formal organization. So the key then is, how do you formalize what would be normally an informal process within all organizations? We're also thinking then about ecosystem, not separate organizations. Who are the organizations you can partner with? How they operate together in a dynamic network, and that there's no permanent structure, but a commonality that may evolve over time as purpose may shift or as new opportunities add to the ability to realize that purpose. Also underneath here then is the foundation for emergent change, the removal of barriers and quickly addressing the conflicts. This is where the purpose alignment becomes a critical component, and that not only is there a network weaving for the shortest connections, but also identification of where conflicts exist, address them, and remove barriers that would in normal organizations be allowed to basically fester, but push down until they become so great a pressing need for change that there is a reorganization. Okay. This then is the key factors we must address when designing organizations. Okay. Let me go ahead and open up to questions. Okay, see, there's been, there we go. Okay, Reg, have you been trying to catch up here? Let's see. Okay, any questions at this time? Go ahead and feel free to jump in with your microphone as I kind of scroll through some of the chats.
There's an interesting question from Laurie Ringart.
Okay.
Laurie, can you explain the direction you're coming at with that question?
Sure. So I really like this this approach that you're presenting on these critical factors, and I just wondered, on a number of organizations that we work with, of course, is they're nonprofit organizations that have boards. So how do you see the structure or the governance model perhaps change as a result of thinking about these factors?
I can handle that, Reg. Then you can jump in too. Part of this goes back to really last year in a discussion that we had in a presentation where we talked about a different way of thinking about leadership in organizations. Traditionally, we thought about a leadership model that was leader-follower centric. We've approached leadership from a personality to functional, to relationships, to activities, a number of different ways. But when you look at it functionally, leadership has to provide direction, alignment, and commitment of the workforce. And once you look at leadership from that perspective, it's no longer necessarily a leader follower centric, because you can do different things structurally and through communication for direction, alignment, and gaining commitment. Once you think about that, then you could also then think about the structure of an organization not being layered of a hierarchy, but how do you do governance in an organization? How do you gain alignment in an organization? And how do you gain commitment? And oftentimes the commitment comes from people working together in teams and networking themselves. The alignment comes from how do you do cross-organization purpose alignment? But then that leaves governance itself, which is where the board would exist relative to an outward look, as well as gaining high-level partnerships, serving as a legal entity, as well as setting direction for the organization. This then allows a rethinking of the board within a role of setting for the governance and setting direction that would apply not only for the for-profits, but for the nonprofits as well. Other comments, Reg? Does that answer the question, Laurie? Or do you want to extend?
I was just curious if there's sort of new models, that align with sort of these, like just new models of governance that align with these new, thinking of new critical factors in organization, because I think of the organization as a whole, and I really like the ecosystem sort of framework. I just was curious about sort of new models in governance almost as well.
Laurie, if I can come in for a second, governance means different things in different countries. And so the first thing is to find out in what context that government's role is and what they need in terms of information, and then ensuring that the control systems within the organization provide that information. If the governance system is also trying to enforce some form of control on the organization, then we have to look at that control requirement and how we plug in the governance requirement into this devolved and distributed authority and decision making. And tomorrow, one of the things that I'm looking at is the power and control in organizations. And I'm suggesting we have to look at it very differently. And so I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to what should the governance model be. because there are different types and levels of governments in organizations. And so I think we have to look at it from a totally new perspective in terms of how the organization is operating and how we connect the two needs.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's really helpful. I agree.
Let me address a comment that Gary had in the chat relative to the informal networks being more important than formal hierarchy. I think to a large extent that's true and has been recognized as true for a long time. Even 40 years ago, when I was an MBA student, there was emphasis on the informal organization, and it was seen as really the way that work often got done because of problems within the formal organization. And to some extent, the reorganizations that traditional organizations undertake is to codify what has been identified as informal workarounds. So to the extent that the formal organization fails to meet this purpose, the organization will find a way and make connections. This gets into the networks that people have all the time. People they've worked with in the past, people they've served with on cross-organization teams, the direct working relationships that they have, any number of connections that people have across the organization, that when they run into a problem that the formal hierarchy is incapable of addressing, they then take it upon themselves to do a workaround and, as necessary, seek permission then from the formal organization. We look at Kotter's dual operating system. To some extent, he tries to formalize the informal organization by recognizing that the formal organization exists and purposely create connections between the formal and the informal organization. So in that dual operating system, he's trying to really take advantage of what's already there, but give it some formalization. But at the same time, he doesn't really take full advantage of how do you enable the informal organization to evolve, and how do you put responsibilities that are traditionally in the formal organization, how do you allow them to move into the more informal way of organizing? Okay. Other questions, other thoughts?
Yeah, Ross, if I can add to that, the article I was reading was about communication channels.
Okay.
And why, and accountability, which I thought was pretty interesting, because the article said that one thing what informal networks are really good about is that they create channels that are context-free, and also that you don't need to store information and be accountable for it. So keep it informal. Yep. And as you say, use all those connections that you've developed as you've moved around the organization. And it also made me think about going to the idea that in the vertical organization, the buck stops there. So you get this vertical thought where sometimes when we look at work actually flows horizontally and actually flows through the informal network. So that article really resonated with me.
Yeah. It gets into some interesting aspects that come from knowledge management. How do you identify who has the knowledge? Traditional approaches to do content management have failed. It's too much work to put the knowledge in. People don't use it. You get into a situation of it's really not useful because you don't know what you need until you need it. Goes back to a lot of what Dave Snowden talks about.
But it also reeks in this thing about we always want to seem to bust silos busting. And there's this counterpoint, wait a minute, that's where the knowledge seems to congregate. And those silos or those groups, they meet at the lunch table together and they share that knowledge. And that's where sometimes informally you call upon those guys, context free, said, hey, what do you know about this? and you get that. If you break up all these silos,
Yep.
you're really kind of ruining all the knowledge you've got in your organization.
I think it's not so much of how to break up the silos, but how do you identify communities of practice and allow knowledge to aggregate? Because that's what we're talking about is aggregation of knowledge, sharing and building. How do you do that in a more dynamic organization that is changing structure?
Yeah.
Gary, if I can come in there a second. You raised two, I think, critical points here: the informal and the expertise. One of the risks with an informal organization is lack of accountability, and so it would be dangerous to adopt an informal organization approach within an organization. I suggest we learn from how it works and then adapt that in the way that's necessary, because we still need accountability and some form of control. And in terms of the experts in the silos, in the functional silos, the irony is that the best expertise tends to be at the top of these silos when they're actually needed at the work level. Increasingly today, we need the expertise at the work level. And I think the old adage of the experts rising to the top and retaining their expert status is vanishing even quicker, because the nature of work and the technology that we're using today has a very short shelf life. And so I think when we look at the functional silos and we start to look at the power and the processes, we must change the lens that we look at them through and start to rethink from the concept of work at the coalface as they did in the 1950s, rather than looking at how we benefit from the functional silos, which we may do. That may be one of the conclusions at the end. But I think if we start there, then we go back to the same problem in the 50s, nothing changes.
Let me jump in and reply to Lisa on a chat. Lisa, I don't know if I fully understand your question, but let me go ahead and give a rough stab at it and then let you respond. But part of the issue here is traditional organizations actually suppress the pressures for change. And they try to suppress it to gain and maintain stability. And to the extent that the people that are facing the problems, they will then be voicing concerns that change is needed, will be raising the issues. But again, that is really suppressed until the change pressure gets so large that the change is then undertaken. And this is where generally a reorganization is the response. Because the changes have not, because the forces for change have not been addressed early, the issue of what could have been a small adaptation then is allowed to build into a much bigger change initiative that requires many more people to be involved at a much larger scale, often within the construct of a reorganization. So the issue so much isn't the changes itself and the need for a champion, it's the need to reduce the barriers that are preventing change from happening. So let me turn that over to Lisa then to see if that addresses your question.
Hi, yes, thank you. It does. I was really interested because one of the challenges in my organisation is that you hear a lot of noise around you saying we need to change. We recognise that, out in the marketplace or in the sector, others are progressing. We feel like our organisation is working at a pace that is far too slow, decision making is far too slow, and you have a disconnect between the appetite to work quite progressively and change quite quickly with a leadership vision that says you have to meander through 10 different decision-making gateways before you can buy a pencil. So that's where I guess I was trying to get to. And sometimes what happens is that I guess that pressure, as you said, becomes critical enough for the leadership or hierarchy to force a shift in their thinking. Alternatively, they press it down and say it's not relevant to this organization. So thank you. Yes, you did answer that.
Yeah. Suppressing the forces for change don't get rid of them. It only postpones them and allows them to grow. Other questions, comments? Okay, this kind of seems to be wrapping things up here. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate your questions and interactions. Now, going forward, Reg tomorrow will be talking about power and control within the organizations. And then on Thursday, I'm going to focus on the alignment piece. A lot of times we talk about how to gain commitment and how to set direction for organizations, but we often jump over what alignment really means. So I'm going to spend some time Thursday talking about that. Any comments, Reg, before we close?
No, just thanks for coming along. And yeah, I look forward to hopefully seeing you tomorrow.
Okay, great. Thank you for everyone and have a good day and enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.